Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people should be aware that this series may contain images, voices, or names of deceased persons.
This episode, Creating a Nation, is part of the series that examines the concept of nation. It begins with the inauguration of the Australian Commonwealth in Sydney and examines the way this country is governed. Much of it is filmed in the gracious interior of Canberra's first parliamentary building, the historic setting of a constitutional crisis that truly rocked the nation.
We're in Centennial Park in the heart of Sydney. It was here, a little over a century ago, that the Commonwealth of Australia came into being.
Centennial Park is one vast natural amphitheatre, and up on the high ground there, thousands and thousands of people gathered to witness that momentous event.
As you can see, it was a great day out, a day steeped in spectacle, ceremony and festivity. Those children dressed in uniforms like sailor suits may not have understood the constitutional niceties of federation, but hey, who wouldn't enjoy a day off school and a crazy twirl around a maypole?
The monument behind us is called the Federation Pavilion. It commemorates the welding of 6 separate British colonies into one Australian nation. And emblazoned across it is Bernard O'Dowd's vision of what the Australian nation might bring. It's a vision of peace and prosperity. It's a commonwealth for the people, not for the rich. It's a new millennial Eden.
Actually, this isn't the original memorial. The Federation Pavilion that once stood here and around which British and Australian dignitaries gathered in all those impressive hats was a much less durable structure. Ornate and picturesque, it was assembled from timber and plaster, a fast and economical way of staging that Federation Festival, but left exposed in Sydney's weather, it melted away with the first heavy rains.
And maybe, just maybe, that's telling us something really important about that Federation moment. Our country may have become a nation in 1901, but really we still lacked what many would call the most enduring symbols of nationhood. Our head of state remained the monarch of another country. We had no flag. Indeed, the flag we fly today is still a British ensign. Courts in Britain could overrule our own, and the highest honour that could be offered our citizens was to confer an English title. The infant Australia had no independent foreign policy, no military forces to call its own. And for over a decade we argued. We argued over where our federal capital might be. New South Wales wanted Sydney. Victorians were determined to have Melbourne. In the end, we had to create an Australian capital territory in between those two fiercely rival states. The city of Canberra rose up on the dusty plains of a sheep run.
And arguably, Australians saw themselves more as a British dominion than an independent nation. Australians grew up reading English novels, they dreamed of English landscapes, they still called the mother country home. And given that the Australian head of state is still a British monarch, it could be argued that we are yet to become a truly independent nation.
Visionaries like Bernard O'Dowd hoped Australia in 1901 would herald in a new Jerusalem. And it's true that around the turn of the 19th century, Australia hosted a raft of progressive legislation. The vote was extended to women here, almost before anywhere else. Arbitration secured a decent living wage. The state extended pensions to the old and free education to the young. In short, we began to build a better and a much fairer society.
Better and fairer, but not for everyone. Australians still saw themselves as a British nation, and that embraced a lot of the inequalities of the empire. So Aboriginal people didn't get the right to vote, and women and so-called coloured labourers, they didn't get an equal wage. If this was the new Jerusalem, It was a very imperfect one.
And you know, federation's a rather imperfect instrument too. This wasn't some declaration of independence, as we saw in the United States, and it certainly wasn't a commitment to a radical new social order. Rather, this is a very pragmatic Australian tradition. It's a tradition of compromise. It's a marriage of convenience between the states. Historians are divided as to why the colonies, each with their separate parliament answerable only to England, agreed to federate in 1901. It may have been the need for defence. It may have been a response to the Depression. And there are a host of practical advantages federation had to offer. Imagine separate gauges for our railways, tariffs and border controls restricting movement from one state to another, a different post, telegraph and currency for every corner of the continent. But what's beyond dispute is that not everyone agreed with federation, and many powers remain vested with the states.
Our constitution was a cunning contrivance. It had to balance the powers of the states with those of the Commonwealth. It had to divvy up resources and responsibilities. It had to decide who could levy taxes and who could benefit. Instead of being boldly new and uniquely Australian, the Commonwealth was cobbled together from past experience. The Australian government operates under what's been called the Washminster system, an amalgam of Westminster and Washington, British and American convention, tradition and precedent.
And what's all that got to do with us today? Well, everything really. Because the political arrangements brokered here in 1901, they still shape the contours of Australia's political life.
So let's head to Canberra and see Australia's government at work.
Let's take a plane, Susan.
A private plane, Bruce. I'm in the chamber of the House of Representatives in the first parliamentary buildings raised by the Australian Commonwealth. The chairs in here are a dark and dusty green, which you may think was chosen because it reflects the Australian landscape. However, you'd be wrong. This green was chosen because it's the exact same hue as the chairs in the House of Commons in London. The Speaker's chair, positioned at the very head of this chamber, is also a reference to Great Britain. It's fashioned from ancient English oak and was a gift from the Parliament on which this Parliament was based. Through those doors in the Senate, the seats are red, like the glowing red of the Aboriginal flag or the red centre of the Outback. No, it's because that colour was used for the House of Lords in London.
Australia borrowed the bicameral system of government from Britain, adopting not just a colour scheme, but an entire system of governance. Where Susan sits now is the lower house. It's modelled on the House of Commons. And this is the upper house. In Australia, we call it the Senate.
Both houses are elected by popular suffrage, or the vote. The House of Representatives is comprised of 150 members. Each member represents one of Australia's 150 electorates, and those electorates are determined by the size of the population. On average, around 150,000 people live in each electorate, and the boundaries of those electorates are constantly being reviewed by the Australian Electoral Commission.
The House of Representatives, Susan's house, that's where government is formed. This house, the Senate, serves a very different purpose. As in the British system, the upper house is a house of review. It debates and it often modifies legislation. But here we see the way that the Australian Constitution looks as much to Washington as it does to Westminster. Britain's upper house was once the preserve of a hereditary elite. The House of Commons represented the people. The Lords, by contrast, the privileged aristocracy that had long governed England. Australia's upper house, by contrast, was democratic from its inception. This was always an elected body, and it served, as the American Senate did, to represent the interests of the states. 76 senators, 12 from each of the 6 states and 2 from each of the territories make up the upper house. Senators serve a 6-year term, but the Prime Minister of this nation must belong to the lower house, the House of Representatives.
Both houses make up our federal parliament, and traditionally there has been a tension between them. In the past, Australia's upper house, like its British counterpart, was seen as a conservative force. Determined to preserve the power of the states, the Senate proved all too willing to block progressive legislation sent up by this chamber. Dividing power between the two houses was ostensibly about checks and balances, but really, it was a brake on social change. The Senate, the House of Review, maintained the status quo, constraining, as upper houses always have, the innovative and inventive forces of democracy.
But times are changing, and so too is the political landscape in this country. Today, it's increasingly unlikely that either major political party, Labor or Liberal, can exercise an absolute majority in this Senate. Now that means that the minor parties can exercise the balance of power. Sometimes these minor parties are conservative, and extremist right-wing elements have certainly found a voice in this chamber. But often the opposite is true. Radical parties, like the Australian Greens, have demanded concessions from the government, their support for legislation contingent on socially and environmentally progressive measures. So more and more, Australian democracy is in flux. Political power blocs no longer rule in their own right. They negotiate, they concede, and they compromise.
There's a third element in Australia's parliamentary system. It's a presence, symbolised by the statue of King George standing in the very heart of the parliamentary foyer. Australia's parliament might debate and draft the laws that will govern this land, but these laws only come into effect with royal assent. The signature of the Governor-General, representing the British monarch, transforms a parliamentary bill into actual legislation.
Australia, like Great Britain, is a constitutional monarchy. The Westminster system emerged over hundreds of years. The power of the Commons, the principles enshrined in the Magna Carta, chipping away at the absolute authority of kings and queens. In much the same way, part of Australia's constitutional history is the way parliamentary independence has evolved and it has strengthened. The locus of power has gradually shifted. In 1901, Australia's constitution deferred to Great Britain. The House of Lords was our nation's ultimate court of appeal. By 1947, the Statute of Westminster shifted sovereignty to Canberra rather than the Crown. Britain renounced any claim to intervene in Australia's affairs. We're a dominion, not a colony.
From the Statute of Westminster on, it seemed only a matter of time before the monarch was not much more than a figurehead. The Governor-General, representing the King or Queen, routinely followed the advice of ministers. Nominally, the monarch's man, or more recently woman, was chosen by the Prime Minister. Then, in 1975, all that changed. An office most people dismissed as a ceremonial cipher reasserted the power of the Crown and brought down a democratically elected government.
And it all began in the chambers of the Australian Senate, right through here. A Labor government had been elected in 1972. Led by the charismatic Gough Whitlam, that government embarked on an unprecedented program of social reform. Australian troops were withdrawn from Vietnam. China was recognised. Military conscription abolished. And Labor introduced a raft of social legislation. Equal pay for women, free medical care, land rights for Aboriginal people, funding for the Australian arts, an end to imperial honours. Almost every piece of progressive legislation was challenged or blocked by this Senate. Despite a second election in 1974 confirming Labor's mandate, the upper house remained in Conservative hands, and therein lay the making of a constitutional crisis. In October 1975, the Senate defers voting on the supply bills, denying Labor the funds with which to govern. That in itself was seen by many as an abuse of power, then what had once seemed unimaginable happened.
Sir John Kerr, Australia's Governor-General, dismissed the government chosen by the Australian people. Kerr then installed Malcolm Fraser, Conservative leader of a minority opposition, as Prime Minister.
On the 11th of November 1975, an unassuming secretary stood on these very steps and read a viceregal proclamation formally dissolving the Australian Parliament. That same day, the House of Representatives, our People's House, passed a motion of no confidence in Malcolm Fraser's caretaker government. Parliamentary convention obliged Fraser to step down. Remember, only those who hold a majority in the lower house can form a legitimate government. But Fraser retained power, a conservative coup based on what many saw as an abuse of executive power. Kerr had acted in the Queen's name, but the Queen herself, mindful of the Statute of Westminster, refused to reverse her representative's decision.
Some thought this would lead to a civil war. It didn't. In fact, Fraser won the next election by a landslide, and a worldwide recession signalled a new regime of economic and political austerity in Australia. But never before had the Commonwealth faced such a crisis. In the wake of 1975, thousands demanded constitutional change. They wanted an end to all ties to the British monarchy and the creation of an Australian republic.
In a way, 1975 signalled the flaws of the Federation Compact created almost a century earlier. But it's important to see the strengths as well as the failings of the Constitution that Australia inherited. Whatever its shortcomings, Australian democracy has proved enduring and robust. Freedoms enshrined since Magna Carta have been compromised but never lost. Our country, although divided often, has been spared the murderous political and ethnic conflict that is commonplace elsewhere.
And we're wrong to see the Australian Constitution as a binding blueprint, confining our vision to the narrow world of 1901. In fact, this is a document accepting of change, upholding through referendum the people's right to change the polity and society they live in.
In 1967, the Australian people voted to repeal two key sections of our Constitution, both discriminating against Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. For the first time, the first Australians were counted in our census, and the Commonwealth empowered to legislate on Aboriginal affairs. In 1999, another referendum raised the possibility of an Australian Republic. And today, there's talk of a Bill of Rights to protect all Australians from racial, sexual, or religious discrimination. Most important of all, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have used a national constitutional convention to reassert their sovereignty. 50 years after the historic 67 referendum, hundreds of delegates gathered at Uluru and issued a statement from the heart of our country. They called for a First Nations voice in our Constitution. We began this episode with the Federation ceremonies marking the new Commonwealth. And we'll end it in the same way. In 1901, Australians gathered in celebration in the streets. They were welcoming a new century as a new nation.
This wasn't just a day for the political elite. Women and children lined the streets. Trade unionists fielded floats and decorated locomotives. Chinese and German, French and American citizens raised colourful arches, a signal of the cultural diversity that would one day come to characterise Australia. And many carried wildflowers in their hands, affirming a sense of belonging in this great southern land.
But there was one group conspicuously absent from the Federation festivities, a group the Parliament we would come to build specifically excluded: Australia's Indigenous people. And they are the creators of this episode's closing object.
In 2001, Sydney-siders took to the streets yet again, fielding a festival to mark the centenary of Federation. And this time, Aboriginal people were central, not excluded. The Koori community marched beside this float, now treasured by the nation in this vast repository run by Australia's National Museum.
Along the side of the float is this vibrant image of the rainbow serpent, symbolising the making of new life. The serpent's creative power, Bronwyn Bancroft reminds us, embodies the theme of hope, the importance of family and the enduring need to live with nature.
Bancroft's float was styled the nation within the nation. In 1901, Australia asserted a singular, white and predominantly British identity.
But 100 years on, we acknowledge our immense debt to the first Australians, the nations that thrive within our nation, and the great strength and the great promise of our shared cultural diversity. If you'd like to learn more about the issues raised in this episode, why not catch Susan Carland in Conversation? This time, Susan's talking with political biographer Jenny Hocking in the National Centre for Australian Studies.